Hey everyone, Andrea here from ProdPad. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm here with our CEO, Janna, and today we'll be talking to you all about Jira. We'll be going over why product managers are own, how to connect to Jira, and most importantly, how to use both pieces of the puzzle together. We'll also be taking a look at how to get Jira set up, a little bit more about the integration with ProdPad, some best practices, and of course, we'll answer any questions that you might have. Some basic housekeeping rules, as always. Feel free to drop your questions in the question tab to the right, as it should be. We will be stopping throughout the webinar and taking questions, so make sure to pop those in as well. We will also be running some polls, so you can answer those on the polls tab. And if you have any other questions or just want to engage, just drop us a tweet at ProdPad. With that said, Janna, the stage is...
Wonderful. Thanks very much for the warm intro, Andrea. And thanks so much, everyone, for coming. Hi, everyone. So today, we're going to be walking you through how to get set up with this really sleek process using ProdPad and JIRA together. We're going to look at how to split your backlogs. You've got approved and ready to go specs on one side, and your more fuzzy backlog of unknowns on the other. We're also going to be looking at how to use your roadmap and your backlog together to prioritize in line with your strategic goals. And then we're going to look at how you can capture the details for each spec and push them over to JIRA, how to actually set up and use that integration. And then we're going to show you how to use the workflow view in ProdPad to get a window into the progress in your development flow. So if you're using JIRA already, you might be asking, what's the difference? Why do I actually need them both? And that's a really good question. It's one that we can help answer today as we walk you through what a great product process actually looks like. So it's not actually a matter of one versus the other. Each tool solves completely different problems. So ProdPad helps you figure out your product strategy, the what to build and why, while JIRA takes over to help your engineering team build it well, the execution or delivery side. Your roadmap, your product roadmap, is meant to be a strategic document. It's like a prototype for your strategy and helps communicate where you are now and where your product vision is taking you in the future. Whereas your release plan is a completely different document altogether, focused completely on the delivery side. A good development process focuses on the execution. It should give your developers the autonomy they crave, but it shouldn't overwhelm them with an untidy backlog of half-formed ideas and not yet approved specs. So this is actually where JIRA excels in keeping the processes, that development process in order. Every development board we've ever seen on JIRA might look something a little bit like this, where it's got some variation of in progress and testing and QA and done workflows. Your own process might have a bunch of other steps in between these, but that's okay. As long as you're watching the work in progress, which is the number of cards or number of tickets in each stage at any time, work in the development process should progress pretty smoothly. But what about that ever-growing list of things that are piling up in your backlog, this list of tickets that are not ready for developers but aren't being worked on? Left unattended, this grows and grows, and it makes it much harder to make informed decisions on what your priorities should be. And it also muddies up your developers' ability to clearly see what they need to be working on next. And we've seen some pretty creative ways from keeping it from getting too unwieldy. Like whether you've got this complicated tagging system or extra boards and workflows. But the reality is that your product backlog should be more than just an ordered list of tickets or cards. If you want to make sure you're building the right things, you need to have a better space to manage your entire product backlog. And so this is where a lot of people get confused because the term backlog is a pretty broad term. So let's split it into these two parts. The development backlog, and this is basically your stack of specs that are ready to go, approved for development, and just waiting for someone in the development team to pick up and start building. This backlog should be relatively short and tidy. It lives in a JIRA board with a status of open or something similar to that, but its input is prioritized, it's ready to go, pushed directly over from your product backlog in ProdPad. So it's a relatively short, manageable list of tickets that live in Jira. Your developers should be able to autonomously pick from this list and know that they're working on the right thing and have enough information to crack on and get it done. Whereas the product backlog is something completely different. You might know it as the opportunity backlog, as Marty Kagan calls it, or by other names. But this is basically the list of all the things you could do in order to build the right product. And naturally, you'll never complete everything on this list, but it is going to be chock full of insights and opportunities, different things you could be doing to innovate in your product. So its inputs are completely far-reaching. This could be from customer requests, suggestions from the team, insights you've gleaned from experiments and prototypes that you've got, and wherever else. And this is the backlog that lives in ProdPad, and it's ready to be sorted, spec'd out in more detail, and signed off by the product team. So we call these tickets ideas. Now, before we dive into using product backlog tools and the roadmap to make strategic prioritization decisions, does anyone have any questions about this process of splitting up your current backlog into these two sections, the development ready and the not? And as a reminder, you've got this questions tab. So Andrea is going to be keeping an eye on this and letting me know if there's any questions. So feel free to keep pumping them in there as we go. In the meantime, I'm going to start moving on to the next section, which is about, now that you've split up your Jira backlog, you can, you've got your actionable tickets in Jira and the rest in ProdPad, but remember that product management is much more than just the delivery. So how do you actually go ahead and track customer problems? How do you manage the influx of input and opinions coming in from across your organization? How do you handle business and revenue objectives or other things that influence your priorities? So ProdPad is where picks up where Jira leaves off. So it helps you manage the complex and tangled interests of your customers while keeping you on track to meet your product vision. So it's going to give you the tools to help you answer questions about the future of your business. What problems do we need to solve? Or what do we need to work on next to move this metric? Or what's our long-term strategy? So ProdPad's going to help you identify where to take your product next, whereas Jira is going to help your team execute the plan. Keeping them separate means that you'll be better at both. So of all the things that are still being spec'd, validated, and approved, things that are in your product backlog, you can use the ideas list. So this is a list that you can view. This is the standard list view that you're looking at right now, which is great for straight sorting and quick triaging. So it's going to help you answer questions like, which ideas are most wanted by our customers, or which suggestions have the biggest impact on our revenue? But let me show you my favorite way of looking at the backlog. For a more holistic view, you can take the step back and look at the priority chart view. So just by clicking on chart, it takes you to a view like this, where each of the dots on this chart represents an idea in your product backlog. The size of the dot indicates how detailed or well spec'd out each idea is. It's like being able to see at a glance whether something is a scribbled out idea on a post-it note or whether it's a thick folder with lots of research supporting the idea. The color of the idea, dot that you're seeing here, indicates how fresh it is. So some of these are bright pink because they've been updated recently, but over time they fade to purple and then to gray, which gives you a great way of seeing at a glance if the idea is falling behind the cracks in the backlog. The ideas are then grouped by impact and effort. So quick wins, the high impact, low effort ideas end up in one quadrant and time sinks end up in the other. And so it's all based on data that you're collecting for each product idea. So you can query your backlog and filter down to find out, what are the ideas submitted around a certain area, whether that's onboarding or the checkout process or analytics or whatever else. Which ideas haven't been looked at in a while and need your attention, or which ideas have your high value customers indicated are most valuable. So combine these filters to give you a lot of control. You might want to find ideas that are most popular with certain customers, that are revenue generating and aren't yet on the backlog, for example, or not yet on the roadmap, for example. So it helps you nail down problem areas really quickly and identify which ideas from your backlog that exist that need to be prioritized and put onto the roadmap. So this is a powerful tool to help you dig through and make the most of your backlog, but the job of the product manager doesn't stop there. Your prioritization can't just be based on what your customers want the most, or what's going to be a quick win, or what's easiest to get to dev. We also know that big pile of features doesn't necessarily make a good product. In fact, it often leads to the opposite. So you need to combine your backlog with a roadmap, which will outline the steps you're going to take to meet your product vision. So a good product roadmap will allow you to stack up your priorities specifically to hit your company objectives without bogging you down into too many onerous details. So for this, you'll need a lean product roadmap. Your roadmap will tell you the bigger story of your product strategy. Each card in your ProdPad roadmap represents an area of focus or a problem to be solved, and each can be connected to objectives. These are your company objectives as tracked in ProdPad. You might call these KPIs or OKRs or simply objectives, but these are the ones that we use because we're a SaaS company, but yours might be different than these, so those are completely configurable. But if you combine so each of the cards in your roadmap then sits in one of these three columns, or what we call time horizons: the current, near term, or future, or the now, next, future format. So your roadmap actually shifts in granularity and scope as it gets further into the future. So cards in the current term tend to be much more granular than the things that are sitting into the future. And if you combine these, you get this lean roadmap format. As I said, you think of these roadmap cards as problems to be solved. Now, each of these cards themselves might have a number of linked ideas or specs. So now we're taking the ideas from our product backlog and combining them in to the roadmap itself. And these ideas or specs can represent features or even experiments that are going to be run to try to solve the problem that the card outlines. So since the development process of coding, testing, and releasing is just a small part of the overall product management flow, most of what's happening in your Jira board is actually going to be represented by cards in your current column. The things in the near term and future column contain cards that represent initiatives or problems that are further away on the horizon that are going to be validated and broken down into more detailed specs later. So the current column is going to have a lot more detail and even include the individual experiments you're going to be running for each. And in ProdPad, we also have this secret column that you'll find is going to be super handy, because the completed column hidden to one side of your roadmap contains cards that represents projects that actually have been completed and released. So in your Jira instance, these are things that have been archived. Your development team has finished them, they've launched them, they've completed the work as spec'd, and they're off focusing on their next upcoming pieces of work. But we all know that just because a feature has been released, it doesn't mean it's actually proven to solve the problem. So you can actually keep track of these projects in ProdPad as part of your completed column, so that you can actually see and refer back to them and make sure that you've actually solved those problems. So it's by combining the guidance of the roadmap with the opportunities surfaced by in your backlog that you can help make better decisions about what should be built next. Now, next we're going to be moving on talking about how we actually connect this all with Jira and send these ideas to Jira for delivery. But do we have any questions in the meantime?
We do. The first one actually kind of made me chuckle a little bit because the question is, why wouldn't a product backlog be prioritized? Seems a little bit straightforward that it would be, but Janna, do you want to talk a little bit about what actually is to prioritize the?
Yeah, and it's a really good question, and that's why we like the idea of splitting the product backlog from the development backlog. Because if you think of your entire product backlog, that could be 1,000 things to do, and you could spend a lot of effort trying to figure out whether something sits at number 752 or 753. At that level of granularity, it just doesn't really make that much sense. Now, what does make sense is to surface things towards the top of that list, float them to the top of the list, and prioritize those. It makes sense to have the next 20 items or next 50 items prioritized and spec'd and ready to go. It doesn't make sense to put the same amount of effort into ticket number 300 as it does ticket number 3. So what you're actually doing is sending things over to Jira where they are prioritized. You do have very granular idea. And likewise, in your actual roadmap itself, in the completed column or attached to each of those cards, you can set granular priorities. But what you're not trying to do, and what a lot of tools attempt to make you do with your backlog, is give a straight priority for everything. And that just tends to be a waste of time. So what you should think about is your product backlog is a list of opportunities, and you might break it up in many ways. There's lots of ways of prioritizing that. It might be by how many customers have asked for something, or what revenue potential it has, or whether it solves a particular problem. Whereas when you're actually prioritizing that development backlog, those ready-to-go specs, you do need that level of granularity with the prioritization. And tools like Jira are amazing for that. You can even use your roadmap to give the high-level priorities for those things before they get sent over.
Any other questions on that?
Any other questions on that?
Yes, we do have one question about roadmaps. Matthew here would like to move into a product-driven roadmap using the current near to the future, but they're currently sales-driven and have contractual obligations due by certain dates. Is there a roadmap view that will help communicate?
Such a good question, and it's one that a lot of people struggle with, because you've kind of got this this fight that happens between teams, this tension, because the development team and the product team can really struggle to come up with really accurate delivery dates without adding lots and lots of buffer. And the more buffer they add, the slower things tend to go, and it means that your company is not operating in a lean way. But your sales and support teams and other folks in your team need to understand what kind of things are coming up and when. So there's a couple areas where you can actually give on those that structure to make sure that people actually understand what's happening. One is that for sales teams or marketing teams who need some prep time to get a release out, they absolutely should have that. And what we recommend in those cases is to separate the soft launch from the hard launch. So many companies attempt to say, we're going to launch this on Thursday, and they're coding and scraping together the last bits and pieces on the Wednesday afternoon or the Thursday morning, right while marketing is about to press the button on the press release the next day, which isn't a great idea. What we recommend doing there is doing a soft launch or some sort of dark launch that only launches it to a subset of your customers, so that you've got a much easier rollout, and that way it takes the pressure off the development team to rush something out the door in case something does go wrong, because often it does, while still giving the marketing team plenty of time, because they know when something will be available. It's already live in a certain way within the app. The other way is that if you've got, the other tension that we find is that if you've got contractual obligations, you've got customers that have paid you to hit a certain project by a certain date. Now, oftentimes you'll find that some companies are operating completely this way, and that's not really a product-driven company. That's more of an agency sort of model where you're building projects to meet particular dates. And if your company is modeled in that, you do need to add that buffer time, and you do need a project plan to show as to why and how you're going to hit those particular dates. Unfortunately, that's more of a project plan problem than it is a product problem. Where we find there's a lot of confusion is that most companies have some sort of blended approach where they're delivering things that are hitting most of their customers or most of their users, but occasionally they have things that have specific due dates and deadlines. Like, for example, almost every company we speak to these days has a card on the roadmap that represents GDPR, right? A particular compliancy thing that most companies in the world are having to deal with right now. This is something that has a hard date, and in cases like that, you can actually put a date on the roadmap and tell people, we are going to have this stuff out by this particular date, but doesn't necessarily mean that the next card has to have it, or the next card. And one of the things that people end up missing with the roadmaps is they tend to assume that because they've put dates on one thing and made a promise on how long it's going to take for one thing, that they have to put on a date for the next thing, and they have to extrapolate those assumptions outwards. And the more assumptions you're stacking into your roadmap, the more chance that you're building the wrong thing or wasting time or missing opportunities in other ways. So if you have to have contractual items, like things that have to be done by particular dates, communicate that on the roadmap. You can add those directly to the cards themselves, but don't feel the pressure to put those on every card. The more dates you're making long-term promises for, the slower your company is going to be able to operate and move and iterate around. I realize there's a bit of a long-winded answer, but it's definitely a complex one that we hear from a lot of people. So happy to follow up with this with more information about that particular tension point and how to do road mapping when in more sales-driven environments.
We do have one last question, which actually leads in really nicely with the next section, which is how do I consolidate my existing Jira backlog with...
Another good one. So chances are you don't have some fresh greenfield product that you're just starting with. You've got an existing messy backlog and all these other things. Don't worry, we hear you. We've worked with hundreds of companies in this situation. What you could do is actually export tickets in Jira that aren't ready to go, aren't approved, clear out everything that isn't prioritized to go to development, and then import that into ProdPad and turn them into ideas. That way you can then work on those ideas in ProdPad, make sure they've got all the inputs, make sure they've got all the context and the right, they're being built for the right reasons, and then when ready, push them over to Jira and they can continue on in the development flow that way. So oftentimes we do meet people who have to clean up their Jira backlog. We've got articles and tips on how to do this, so we can send those around afterwards as well. Which, Andrea is right, takes us really nicely into the next section. So you've got an idea in your ProdPad product backlog, you've spec'd it out, you've added it to the roadmap among your other priorities, and now it's ready for development. So this next part makes it pretty easy. Each idea in ProdPad has a bunch of handy fields to help you spec it out. You can capture things like the business case or description of the feature. You can break it down into user stories. You can add functional specs and files and designs and a whole bunch more. Once ready, you can simply click one button to push it to Jira. The idea in ProdPad becomes a ticket in Jira and will land on your board as open or ready for development or similar to that. And this is now an approved, ready to go ticket that lives in your development backlog, ready for developers to pick it up, build it out, and deliver it. So the thing with the Jira integration is that it is quite configurable because Jira itself is basically infinitely configurable. So we've built ProdPad to allow you to decide which fields get carried over and which statuses or which boards get synced back to your ProdPad backlog. So this is getting into the guts of it. We're going to show you how to actually set up a Jira integration. Now, don't worry about writing all these down. We will follow up with a step-by-step guide on how to do this. But basically, this is the gist of it. You go into ProdPad and go to the integrations page. So you can access this from the top corner. You click on the button to create a Jira integration and give it a descriptive name. And the important thing here is to give it a name that describes which project it's going to go to. Now, if you just have one team in Jira and they're all going to be working on the same thing, you can just call it Jira development. And that way, when you're pushing to Jira, you know it's going to Jira. If you've got different teams, then maybe call it Jira Team X and Jira Team Y. If you've got different projects, maybe label them by the project. So give it a descriptive name that'll help you remember which one it is you're pushing to when you do that. And enter the base URL. A couple gotchas here. Remember to include the trailing slash and use HTTPS. But this is the URL that you guys access your Jira at. One other quick gotcha, if you're on an on-premise version of Jira, we do support that. If it's behind a firewall, we still support that. We do have a set of ports to open up to get through firewalls. So again, we'll include an article that shows you which specific ports to include and steps that you'll need to consider. Next one is that you want to head over to Jira itself, and you want to be a Jira administrator for this. Head to Settings, Applications, Application Links, which takes you to this section here where you basically create this new application link. This is basically just 5 minutes of copy-paste work. Again, the guide walks you through exactly what to copy and paste, and in ProdPad it shows you your public key, which you would then paste into your Jira instance. You then go back to ProdPad and authorize. Now, the ProdPad Jira integration uses OAuth, so it checks who you are, that you've got access to Jira, and checks which projects you have access to in Jira itself. Now it gets to the fun part, because now we pull through and figure out which projects you have, and you can choose from a drop-down list of which project this particular integration is going to push to. And then you get to choose which ticket type is created from ideas and which ticket type is created from user stories. Now, typically, the matches, ideas become epics and stories become stories, but these are completely configurable in Jira, and therefore you can configure them in here just using this drop-down. The next step, you then pick which fields from ProdPad ideas are going to be pushed over to Jira. So the labels that you see in bold along the top here are Jira fields, and the ones down the side with the check marks are ProdPad fields. So you can choose to push things like the business case and the functional specs to the description field. You can label it with the products and tags. You can send over the designs and files as attachments in Jira. Again, pretty configurable because the fields in your Jira Epic or other tickets might be different than what you see here. And this can be done at the idea level as well as at the user story level. The next step is to map out the workflow stages. So in ProdPad, every idea starts off as a new idea, but you can set up different workflow stages. You might have a few stages that outline, what's happening as it's being spec'd in design, another few stages that outline what's happening in development, and then other stages that happen after that. So again, the items in bold are the Jira statuses. And again, these can be configured as well. So these might look different to you, but you're basically saying that when a ticket is pushed to Jira, it becomes open. And at the moment that it's open, then reflect back in ProdPad and update the status in ProdPad to queued for dev. When the developer picks it up and moves it to in progress, update it automatically in ProdPad to move it to the in development flow. So you can actually set this up to map your workflow together. And what we recommend is creating a simplified view into your Jira. You don't necessarily have to map back every status because you don't necessarily need to tell everyone of every movement that happens, but it certainly does help you create a view into things and see how things are progressing through development. Next, this is an optional one, but we recommend doing it because you can make each of these integrations team-wide. So you might have just gone through and done the 10-15 minutes that it took to set up all those different things and configure how those ideas are being pushed. Now, if you make it team-wide, your colleagues can come into their integration section. They can simply authorize themselves for the same integration point, and it just simply copies over all the settings. So if you make a change to yours down the line, it'll make a change for everybody else's. That way you've done the hard work of setting it up, and they can just use the integration as you do. And so that takes us back to that simple one-click push. So once you're actually in an idea, you can click push to development, choose which development integration you want to push to. Now in our demo here, we have a number of different tools. ProdPad does support pushing to multiple tools at the same time. So if you've got a team on Trello and another team on Jira, this will still work. If you've got 2 different Jira instances or 2 different projects on Jira, they'll just be listed in here. And you'll be able to just simply push them over and it will create the ticket in Jira as specified by the mapping, and you'll be good to go. And so that's it. You've just pushed an idea from Jira to from ProdPad to Jira. I'll have to update that slide. So now what you're also going to have then are people who are wondering where the ticket's actually gone, right? So the idea remains in ProdPad, but it does have a link to Jira. But that's why we have this workflow view. So once something's been sent to Jira, you'll want to keep an eye on progress. So keep in mind that your product is made up of more than just your product and your engineering teams. You've got marketing, support, sales, and tons of others who are also responsible for what's going on. And each team has a different stake in the product. They're submitting ideas, they're hearing complaints and suggestions, they've got insights to share, and they kind of want to know what's going on within the product and development teams. But if they're not in engineering, Jira can be pretty scary. It can be pretty confusing and overly complicated for somebody who doesn't work in their day by day. After all, most Jira boards have more than the simple in progress, QA, and done stages. It might have a ton of different stages in between there. So what you can actually have them do is have the wider team add their needs to ProdPad. They can focus on what's important. They can explain the problem. They can back it up with customer feedback and other screenshots or data. And it creates this fuller picture for the development team to work on so that when something's pushed to Jira, they've got that context. And as the Jira ticket moves through the process, the status reflects back into the ProdPad workflow view, which is what you're seeing here. So this view, everyone can look up the status of the ideas that they care about, including the ones that are already in JIRA, and it basically allows you to create this window into your development process that's friendly enough for everyone to understand. So as I said, the options for mapping are really flexible, and it creates a simplified view of your development process. And so that's what makes JIRA and ProdPad a real dream team. So you're able to seamlessly sync your product backlog, which is now enriched with all the data points to make the right decisions about why and what you're going to build, as well as keep an eye on how everything's progressing through development. So your developers should have some sanity now. They've got a tidier board in JIRA that doesn't include a bunch of tickets that aren't ready to go, but you've also got tighter control and visibility on what's being built and for the right reasons. So with the integration, all you have to do is push the specs right over to development and you're on to the next step. So JIRA and ProdPad aren't in competition in any way. They're a partnership of strategy and execution. So JIRA is great for developers. ProdPad is designed for the entire flow, including the product managers and their teams. That's why, like thousands of other companies, you should be using both. It gives you access to, so ProdPad itself gives you access to a whole range of different functionality that you can't get in JIRA. So things like the customer feedback, the priority chart, stakeholder management and collaboration and discussions from around your team, linking things to user personas and the goals that they have, and even down to pulling in your designs and annotating them and having discussions around what things are going to look like before it's sent to development. And the JIRA integration is free as part of our core platforms, and it's one of the most popular ones that are on our platform. It just takes a few minutes to set up, so start your trial today, and hope to see you guys around. In the meantime, we've got plenty of time for questions, so I'm happy to answer your questions and make sure you guys feel comfortable getting set up.
Sure. First question is, how can you display issues that are part of a close sprint?
Tickets that are part of a closed sprint. As far as I understand, you should be able to push tickets over to JIRA, and it's using JIRA webhooks in order to report back the status of those. My understanding is that there's no restrictions on that, but perhaps we can take this offline and we can discuss and make sure that there's no further questions there. I'm not sure we have any distinction between closed or open sprint, and I'll be honest that I don't entirely understand what that means. So apologies, don't have that one, but I don't think there's any restrictions. So let's take that one offline.
The next question is, does JIRA sync back into ProdPad?
So the status of the JIRA ticket syncs back into ProdPad, respecting the mapping, but we don't do syncing of the fields themselves, and there's a really good reason for that. One is that we don't want to have so when you push something over to JIRA, that ticket might take on a different form as it's being moved through. The developers might break it down into more detail, they might add more technical notes and that sort of thing. We don't want to have their notes accidentally overwriting data, the context where the idea came from in ProdPad. Likewise, we don't want to resync from ProdPad automatically because that could overwrite some of the more technical notes that have been done in JIRA. And it comes down to things like data conflict management as well. If you've got, it's hard enough to manage conflicts of data if you've got two people typing in the same page in the same tool, let alone when you've got a 5-minute delay between tools with the syncing, which means that any forced overwrites, any automatic overwrites could put your data at risk, and we don't want to do that. So what tends to happen is that when you push something over to JIRA, kickoff point, and the developers then have the original context, the idea in ProdPad, if they need to look back at it, the ticket in JIRA would have a link back to that, but then they can freely update that ticket in JIRA and take that along with more information as they go.
Cool. Our next question is, how do you get an existing JIRA epic or story linked to an idea or user story in ProdPad?
So if you've got existing tickets in JIRA, what you can do is export them and remove them from JIRA, close them in JIRA, and import them back into ProdPad. When you push it over back to JIRA, it will create a new ticket, but obviously it'll have the same information or whatever's been updated in ProdPad at that particular point in time. So that allows you to track it through from the conception through to the actual delivery side. If you've got something in JIRA today that is, partway through being delivered and it doesn't yet exist in ProdPad, we don't have a way of retrospectively connecting those ones. But what you can do is you can create a link manually between the two. So it doesn't work automatically because you don't have the push to JIRA button. But you can create a link in ProdPad and you can create a link in JIRA. And that way you can keep an eye on the progress there. But over the course of the next few sprints, everything in JIRA should be moved through, and that way everything in JIRA hopefully has come from ProdPad using that integration and pushed over and carried through using the automatic syncing.
The next question is something we were talking about today, which is what is the minimum version of JIRA that is supported by the integration?
I'm really glad you asked, and that actually kicked off a debate today because we know that version 7.2 for their online version is the last one that Atlassian supports. However, we have no reason to believe that it doesn't work anything, so that versions 5 and 6 should still work absolutely perfectly based on the integration that we have. So if you are on an older version, like a 5 or a 6, it should still work. We don't have any complaints from anybody who is using those versions. I do know that we don't support 4 and under, but I don't think anybody should be using 4 and under at this point in time, keeping in mind that Atlassian only supports 7.2 and above.
One more question here, and guys, remember, if you do have any questions, pop them in. Pete would like to know, what if you push a user story without pushing the whole idea?
Great question. So I didn't go into detail on this, but ideas can be broken down into individual user stories. And those ideas in the user stories can either work in tandem or independently. So you can take a whole idea and put that on the roadmap and then track the progress there, or you can actually take individual user stories and put them on the roadmap or send them to development. So some different use cases, it might be that you've got an idea that is being delivered by 2 different teams. So you might have this set of user stories, five user stories sent to team 1 and another 5 user stories sent to team 2 in a different integration. The other use case might be that you've got part of it being done now and part of it being done at some point in the future. So it might sit in the future in the roadmap and then is sent over at another time. What you can do is when you push the idea, you have the choice of pushing the entire idea or the entire idea with the user stories or individual user stories. If you push an idea and whether or not it has user stories, it'll create that epic or whatever you created in JIRA. If you then add user stories and then push that idea again and say include user stories, it won't create a new epic in JIRA. It'll just create those new user stories and add those to the epic in JIRA itself. So that's a use case for teams who need to send over sort of the high level version of the idea first and then break it down in more detail. Oftentimes there are new stories or new features or bits that were missed from the original spec. So you can add those to ProdPad and then selectively push them over to JIRA. Hopefully that helps answer that one.
We've got another interesting one here. Do high-level estimates of ideas and stories before they get pushed to development in JIRA. And I don't know if that's specific to us, but we can talk about that. And how do you estimate effort on?
So yes, you can do high-level estimates of ideas before they get pushed. In ProdPad, we have what we call the impact and effort scores. And the impact and effort scores are based on we've got 3 different scales. So we've got one that says 0 to 100, another one which is a simple 1 to 10 scale, another one which is t-shirt sizing, so small, medium, large. What we recommend for these is not necessarily your detailed development efforts, your development estimates, but more of that high-level estimation of that product manager gut feel meter. When somebody comes to you with an idea, almost immediately you've got this gut feel as to, this actually sounds like it's really difficult difficult, so we're going to set this as high effort, or this actually sounds really simple and straightforward, so it gets set as low effort. It's not meant to be an exact science, but it does give you this nice way of giving these relative sizes and whatnot. One thing to remember when you're setting efforts at the ProdPad level and the entire product process level is thinking about not just how many days or dollars it's going to take to get through development, but how much effort is it going to take for the entire company to pull this off. Something might be straightforward to develop, but has implications for the legal team or the support team or the sales team or other teams to manage and support and to make successful. Whereas other things might be straightforward for the business, but much more difficult for development. So keep in mind the entire effort when you're setting your impact and effort. And that way, when it's actually pushed to JIRA, that's where it's broken down into much more detailed development specs. For that, I recommend using tools like Planning Poker, which is a great exercise you can do with the team to get estimates on things, or just making sure that everyone has an agreed understanding as to, how do you measure a story point, or what does that look like? At the end of the day, any estimates that go into development should be made for setting internal milestones and goals, not for setting external due dates and deadlines, because we all know how complex and non-linear development can be. And so, any reflection of how many points existed for a story might not reflect back on original estimates once they've actually been built and understood and delivered by the development team.
I think that's it. Oh, no, that's not it. We have one more. Oh, this is an idea. Tiago, we'll take that one offline because it's more of a suggestion. But thank you. We'll definitely add it to our backlog. Any more questions coming in? Have any, do it now. If not, thank you guys all for coming and asking all these great questions.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, guys. It's been great chatting with you. If you do have further questions, then by all means, reach out to us. We're always here to help. hello@prodpad.com, or chat to us in the app when you're using the app. If you haven't started a trial, get in there today. It is a completely free trial, and you'll be able to talk to myself and the rest of the team as you get set up if you have any questions at all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.